The glass mansion seemed to breathe with the sky. The translucent walls reflected the golden hues of dusk, as if the entire house were immersed in amber, frozen in time. From the outside, there was beauty. From the inside, a silence that screamed. Elena walked barefoot across the white marble floor. Her steps made almost no sound, as if she had learned not to disturb. The mansion was far too large for a single soul. Yet, she had been there for 3 years, like an invisible guest in her own husband's life. In the main hall, a metallic sculpture rose in a spiral, cold and elegant. Everything had been designed to impress. Designer furniture, rare paintings, the scent of noble wood and Sicilian lemon lingering in the air, coming from diffusers discreetly placed around the rooms. But there were no picture frames, no traces of memories. The house had no Pastonia present, and the future no one dared to imagine. Ethan Lancaster owned it all. An empire. Corporations in 4 countries. Magazine articles called him the most influential CEO under 40. Employees feared him. Shareholders revered him. And Elena was merely the woman he had married, without ever, in fact, touching. She looked out through the large library window. Outside, the garden was too perfect, symmetrical, not a single flower out of place. She tried to be the same, orderly, quiet, dependable. But something inside her broke a little more each day. They didn't share the same room, had never slept together. Their encounters were limited to occasional dinners where the clinking of cutlery said more than words. He fulfilled his duties as a formal husband, but emotionally, he was never truly there. And it had never been easy to endure that. Elena missed being seen. Not as the wife of a powerful man, but as a woman. As someone with warmth in her skin, longing in her eyes, and hope of being desired. It was an absence that wasn't spoken aloud, but it burned like a slow fever. That afternoon, Ethan entered the house without fuss. The subtle sound of the automatic door opening marked his arrival. Elena saw him pass through the glass corridor with his dark leather briefcase, as impeccable as ever. Tailored suit, perfectly combed hair, restrained expression. He looked at her for a brief second, did not smile, said nothing. She, out of habit, said, "Dinner will be ready in 30 minutes. He nodded with a slight movement of the head and headed toward the office. It was always like that, a choreography of polite, emotionless gestures. But that night, something was different. Elena couldn't say what. Perhaps it was the way he paused for 1 second longer before climbing the stairs. Perhaps the way his eyes seemed to hesitate. Or perhaps it was just her, fooling herself again. While slicing tomatoes for the salad, the sound of the knife against the cutting board filled the kitchen with an almost hypnotic rhythm. It was the only sound there. No music, no voices. Just the soft clink of steel, marking time like a hidden clock. She thought about what she would say if she had the courage. Thought about asking why he had chosen her. Why he got married, if he had no intention of loving. She even thought about asking, for a hug. Something so simple and yet so unattainable. But she remained silent. When they sat at the table that night, the silence was broken only by the usual words. "How was your day?" she asked, in the sweet, restrained tone she had learned to use. "Productive," he replied, without lifting his eyes from the plate. Nothing more. Nothing beyond the protocol. At the end of the meal, he thanked her, as if closing a deal, and went up to the upper floor. She stayed there, staring at the empty plate, trying to remember the sound of her own laughter. Elena gathered the cutlery, washed everything, turned off the lights. As she passed through the living room, she saw the reflection of the house in the glass. And for a second, she saw herself as part of that cold architecture, a beautiful ornament, but without real purpose. In that moment, she knew. Something inside her no longer wanted to wait in silence. And as she climbed the stairs that night, her heart whispered something she didn't fully understand yet. Something was about to change. 3 years before that silent night, the Manhattan sky looked like it was made of shattered glass. The heavy clouds covered the skyscrapers, like a reminder that, even among power and luxury, There were shadows no one could control. Elena was sitting in a cheap cafe near the public hospital, where her mother was receiving treatment. The air smelled of rain mixed with burnt coffee and despair. Her bank account barely allowed her to buy bread, and the next month's rent was already overdue. She held a crumpled envelope in her hands. Inside, an eviction notice and a cruel diagnosis. Her mother's illness had progressed, and the necessary treatment cost more than her entire life could ever yield. At that very moment, her phone buzzed with an unexpected message. "Mr. Ethan Lancaster would like to speak with you. The meeting will be tomorrow at 10 a.m. She almost laughed, thought it was a mistake. But her name was right there. And when she arrived at the address the next day, she was greeted by an elegant secretary who led her down a glass corridor to the last office on the 48th floor. Ethan was sitting behind a minimalist desk, looking out at the city like someone who had already conquered it. He wore a dark blue suit that seemed tailored for his own silence. He didn't stand up. He just looked at her with intensity and said, "Elena Marks, please, have a seat." She obeyed, tense. She had never seen him in person, but knew his name from the newspapers. He was a market titan, known for never smiling, never being late, and never losing. "I need a wife," he said, directly, "and I'm not interested in emotional involvement." Elena widened her eyes. "Is this a proposal?" "It's a contract," he replied. "An agreement that will be beneficial for both of us. You will have complete financial security. Your mother will have access to the best treatment. And in return, I only ask for your discretion, your presence at social events, and above all, that you comply with the clauses." He slid a document across the desk. Elena looked at it, incredulous. Everything was there. Cold clauses, as if part of a corporate merger. No intimacy required. No physical contact. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan stared at her for a long second before replying. "There are things I can't explain, but I need this marriage. And you need the chance to save your mother." Elena didn't sleep that night. She stared at the ceiling of her small room, listening to the sound of oxygen tubes in the bed beside hers. She thought about the bills, thought about her mother smiling through the pain, thought about herself, her shelved dreams, her loneliness that felt like a sentence. And then, she decided. The wedding took place on a gray late afternoon. No flowers, no guests. Just the two of them and a hired judge. Elena wore a simple, rented dress. Ethan, an impeccable suit. He didn't touch her. There was no kiss. Just a cold handshake and a contract signed in silence. On the first night in the new house, she was given her own room, overlooking the lake. Everything was too luxurious, too large, and empty. Elena realized she had been placed there as a strategic piece, not as a wife, but as a convenient presence. In the first months, she tried to remain neutral, fulfilled her role at company dinners, smiled for photos, wore the expensive dresses sent to her. But inside, she felt increasingly invisible. Ethan kept his distance, always cordial, always polite, but never vulnerable, never close. Once, she tried to start a more intimate conversation after a gala dinner. "Have you ever thought about trying something real?" she asked, eyes full of doubt. He looked at her with an unreadable expression, and replied in the most neutral voice she had ever heard, "Too much reality has already cost me dearly." After that, she stopped asking, but she never stopped feeling. The days passed with mechanical precision. Wake up at 7. Coffee served in silence. Ethan left for work. Elena stayed. At night, they dined together at the same massive table where the chairs seemed too far apart for two married people. Then he would go up to his office or disappear into the room next door, and the cycle would begin again. Elena didn't know exactly when things began to change inside her. Maybe it was on a rainy morning when Ethan forgot his umbrella and she ran to the door to hand it to him. He looked at her for 2 seconds longer than necessary, thanked her with a subtle nod, but his eyes, in that moment, seemed less cold, more human. Or maybe it was when she saw him asleep on the office couch, surrounded by papers and charts, his brow furrowed as if he were still fighting, even in his dreams. She approached carefully, covered him with a blanket, and for a second, allowed herself to see that man as something more than a concrete fortress. The truth is that Elena began to notice everything he didn't say. The way he clenched his hands when he was tense. The meticulous way he organized everything around him. His silence which, if listened to carefully, told more stories than words ever could. And no matter how much she tried to control it, the heart didn't know how to wait. It started beating differently when she heard his footsteps upstairs. It tightened slightly when he complimented her appearance with a simple, "You look appropriate for the occasion," which, to her ears, sounded almost like a shy compliment. It was ridiculous, she thought. Falling in love with a man who treated her like a well-behaved employee. A man who had never touched her, who never opened his soul. But love has its own logic or the complete lack of it. Elena found herself smiling when thinking about him, and hated herself for it, but she allowed it nonetheless. Little by little, she began changing small gestures in her routine. Chose her dresses more carefully. Took care of the garden so he would have something beautiful to see when he returned. Even learned how to prepare his coffee exactly the way he liked it, strong, no sugar, with a touch of cinnamon. One day, while placing the cup on the table, he observed her long enough for her to feel it. But, as always, he looked away and left. Elena knew she was alone in that feeling. Knew that he would probably never reciprocate. And even so, it was impossible to pretend she didn't feel. One Saturday afternoon, she decided to do something she hadn't done in a long time. She painted. Spread out canvases and paints on the terrace, and there, let her heart speak for her. Intense colors, quick brush strokes, images that burst forth like silent screams. She didn't even notice that Ethan had arrived home early that day. "You paint," he said, watching from a distance. She was startled, the brush still in the air. "I haven't painted in a long time," she replied. "Is that you?" He was referring to a canvas, where a woman with closed eyes was immersed in a blue storm. "It's what I feel," she said. Ethan was silent for a moment. Then, he nodded slightly and walked away. She stayed there, alone among the paints, her heart pounding loudly. For a moment, he had come closer. For a moment, she saw a reflection of possibility. But, like every other time, he pulled back. And what remained was only the sound of the wind, tousling her hair as if it were the only thing capable of touching her. That night, Elena lay staring at the ceiling, imagining what it would be like to feel his hands holding hers. Not out of obligation, but out of desire, by choice. She knew she was diving in alone, but there was something inside her that didn't know or didn't want to stop. Because there are hearts that close themselves, and there are hearts that simply don't know how to wait. The office clock marked nearly midnight when Elena passed through the hallway and heard voices. It wasn't common for there to be visitors at that hour. She hesitated in front of the half-open door, sensing Ethan's woody cologne mixed with the faint metallic smell of freshly printed papers. The voices were coming from inside. "You need to settle this soon," said a man. It was Adrian, Ethan's older brother, always direct, always impatient. 3 years is too long, even for you. "It's not that simple," Ethan replied, his tone hoarse, almost weary. "You're hiding behind this contract, like it's a shield. But you and I both know this was never about business." There was silence. Elena held her breath, frozen in the dark hallway. "She looks at you like you're everything she has," Adrian continued, his voice gentler now, "and you pretend not to see it. How long do you think that'll last?" "I don't pretend," Ethan replied. "I see it, and that's what scares me." Those words hit Elena like stones to the chest. She took a step back, retreating before she could be noticed, entered her own room and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling her heartbeat pulsing in her temples. He saw it, he knew, and even so, he remained distant. She wondered what was behind all that rigidity that kept him from getting close. The next day, the answer came when she least expected it. The weather was gloomy. Gray sky, humid wind. Elena went down to the garage to grab a book she had left in the car. On the way, she saw Ethan in one of the smaller rooms, looking at an old photograph. He was alone, sitting in a leather armchair, his eyes fixed on the image. His face showed no expression, but his entire body seemed to say something between pain and exhaustion. She stopped at the door. "Sorry," she said, almost in a whisper. He didn't hide the photo or try to disguise it. He simply turned it in her direction. It was a woman with dark hair, a wide smile, holding a wine glass. Young, alive. Elena didn't recognize her. Her name was Eva, he said, without emotion. "We were engaged." Elena felt the air grow thin in her chest. "She died." Ethan shook his head with a slight ironic smile. "No, she left me." The response was delivered coldly. But there was a crack beneath that surface of indifference. A month before the wedding, he continued. "After 2 years of promises, she said she couldn't live with a man like me, that she preferred someone lighter, easier to love." Elena didn't know what to say. "Since then, I've realized love is too risky an investment. I prefer business, contracts, nothing that can't be predicted." "And me?" she asked, unable to hold back. Ethan looked at her for the first time in that conversation. A firm, deep gaze, but still surrounded by walls. "You're safe. You brought me peace. But, ... He hesitated. "I never promised love." Elena nodded slowly. There was nothing new in that sentence. And yet, it was as if she were hearing it for the first time. That night, lying in her bed, she tried to picture Ava's face. Tried to imagine the kind of love that could make a man like Ethan close himself off completely. And she thought of her own heart, that even rejected, even wounded, still waited. Because money could buy comfort, silence, even a marriage. But it couldn't heal a wound that bled in silence. Winter arrived silently, covering the windows with mist, and the garden with dry leaves. The days were shorter, the nights longer, and Elena more tired. A fatigue that wasn't just physical, but emotional. A weight she carried on her shoulders, in her gaze, and in the spaces between the smiles she no longer gave. It was on a cloudy morning, with a scratchy throat and a pounding head, that she fainted. Her body collapsed without warning on the cold kitchen floor. The last thing she saw was the dim light reflected on the marble ceiling. Hours later, she awoke in a white room, to the persistent sound of a heart monitor. The brightness of the room stung her eyes. She tried to sit up, but a firm hand gently held her arm. "Easy. Stay lying down." The voice was his. Ethan was there, sitting beside the bed, without a suit, sleeves rolled up, and a worried look in his eyes. It was the first time she had seen him like that. Vulnerable. Present. "You fainted," he said, his voice lower than usual. "You were dehydrated, stressed, sleeping poorly, not eating well." She tried to smile, but even that hurt. "I'm fine," she murmured. "No, you're not," he replied, "and I should have noticed sooner." The phrase hung in the air. He looked at her as if truly seeing her for the first time. And there was something in his eyes that mixed guilt with a contained care, like someone who didn't know how to handle what he felt. "Why did you come?" she asked, her voice weak. He hesitated. Because I'm your husband." The words sounded almost strange, as if he himself didn't believe them, but they were there. And for a moment, they were enough. Over the next 2 days, Ethan visited her in the hospital in the morning and evening. He brought subtle flowers, books, coffee from the place she liked. He didn't stay long, but his presence was different. Silent, but attentive. On the 3rd night, when she woke from a bad dream, he was there. Asleep in the room's armchair, his head tilted to the side, fingers intertwined in his lap. She watched him for long minutes, storing that moment in silence. On the day of her discharge, he was the one who helped her put on her coat. His hands touched her shoulders gently, almost without contact. But for Elena, that simple gesture carried more intensity than any words spoken over the past 3 years. In the car, on the way home, The silence was different. A dense silence, not of absence, but of things unspoken. Things that, perhaps, were finally trying to be born. "Thank you for everything," she said, looking out the window. He didn't respond right away. "I should have done more," he murmured. She wanted to ask what that meant, but didn't want to break the moment. Not yet. Arriving home, he helped her out of the car. For the first time, he held her hand, not as a formal gesture, but as someone holding something fragile and precious. And Elena felt that, in that brief touch, something was opening. Something she had been waiting for years. But when they reached the mansion's main hall, he let go of her hand. Again, the distance. Again, the old Ethan. That night, Elena went to her room with a heart divided between hope and frustration. And there, sitting on the edge of the bed, she decided to write. She picked up paper and pen and began pouring out everything she carried in her chest. She wrote about the days she wanted to give up, about the nights she cried in silence, about the small gestures that made her believe. She wrote about love, absence, longing for something that never happened. She wrote to him. No filter, no contract. The letter ended with one sentence. "If one day you touch me, let it be because you feel it, not because you have to." She folded the paper and placed it in the drawer of the dresser. She didn't know if she'd ever have the courage to give it to him. In the early hours, she was awakened by a faint noise in the hallway. She got up, opened the door slowly, and saw Ethan's silhouette standing in front of her room. He didn't enter, just stood there for a few seconds, then touched the doorknob, but changed his mind. He turned and walked away. She returned to bed, eyes brimming. It still wasn't the moment. The touch hadn't come yet, but inside her, something whispered. It was closer than ever. The invitation arrived in a black envelope with embossed golden letters. Ethan's main company was celebrating 20 years in the market, and the presence of the Lancaster couple was expected. It was the first time in 3 years that Elena would appear as his official wife at a major event. In the bedroom, she looked at the dresses hanging. All elegant, cold, chosen by the company's image consultancy. But she wanted something different that night. Something that said, even if only to herself, that she was still alive. She chose a deep burgundy satin dress. It hugged her figure, but without vulgarity. The neckline was modest, the fit delicate, but there was one detail, a subtle bow on the back, like a childhood memory that refused to disappear. When she came down the stairs, Ethan was waiting at the bottom. He wore a flawless dark suit. His eyes, upon seeing her, hesitated for a second. Just a moment, but Elena noticed. "You look different," he said, in a tone too neutral for what his eyes were showing. "It's the first time I've worn something for myself," she replied. He nodded, offered his arm. She accepted. The hotel ballroom was packed. Huge chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting golden reflections on the marble. The sound of violins mixed with clinking glasses, polite greetings, and the soft flash of cameras. Elena smiled with elegance, answered questions about the marriage with measured phrases. Ethan, at her side, maintained his usual demeanor, cordial, composed, unreachable. But she knew, she felt, something was different that night. He didn't let go of her arm. His eyes followed her every move. And when a young executive approached with a compliment that was far too enthusiastic, she noticed Ethan's hand gripping her arm more firmly. "I didn't know Mr. Lancaster was the jealous type," the man joked, already too drunk to choose his words. Ethan didn't respond. He simply looked straight into the man's eyes. And that was enough for the other to walk away, laughing awkwardly. Later, in a corner of the ballroom, Elena stared at the mirror on one of the marble columns. She watched her own reflection and, in the background, they weren't standing close, but something between them filled the space like electricity. "You look beautiful," he said unexpectedly, approaching her. She looked at him in surprise. His eyes held no armor, no mask. "Do you know what you're doing to me?" he asked, softly, only for her to hear. Elena didn't respond. She didn't know. And at the same time, she knew too much. Before she could say anything, the award ceremony began. Ethan was called to the stage, applauded as the titan everyone admired. He spoke firmly, thanked the staff, maintained the posture of the invincible CEO. But when his eyes found hers in the audience, there was a crack there. A man inside the armor. A man who, finally, was beginning to hurt from within. On the way home, the silence between them was heavy. The car glided over the wet road, headlights cutting through the fog forming on the pavement. "Why have you never told me I looked beautiful before?" she asked, staring ahead. He took a while to respond, "Because I was afraid to start something I couldn't finish." She looked at him from the corner of her eye, said nothing, but she felt it. It had begun. That night stayed with Elena like an echo, not because of the applause or the dress, but because of the way he looked at her. The tension in his fingers when she slid her hand onto his arm. The restrained jealousy. The whispered phrase, like a secret he could no longer escape from. But, as always, the next day, Ethan pulled back. He returned to the office early, spent dinner in silence, disappeared after a phone call that lasted more than an hour. Elena understood the pattern. It was always like that. One step forward, 2 steps back. She felt suspended between 2 worlds, hope and resignation. Sitting at the desk in her room with a lukewarm cup of tea forgotten beside her, she picked up pen and paper. There was something inside her that needed to come out, words that had never found space in that house full of silence. "Ethan, I don't know why I'm writing this, if you'll probably never read it, but maybe writing will help me exist somehow, ... The pen moved hesitantly at first, then steadily, as her heart took over. She wrote about the first time she saw him, the strangeness of becoming the wife of a man she barely knew. She wrote about the suffocating loneliness, the fear of being just a shadow. She wrote about the first time she admired him when she saw him asleep on the couch. Wrote about the brief touch in the hospital, about the untied bow on the back of the dress, about the desire to touch him without scaring him. Maybe you'll never love me, and I should accept that, but my heart still insists on waiting. I just wanted you to know that, even without touching me, you changed me. And if one day you decide to touch me, let it be because you feel it, not because you have to." Elena stopped, took a deep breath, and cried. But not out of anger, nor despair. It was the cry of someone who needed to empty herself in order to keep going. She folded the letter carefully, placed it inside a brown envelope, stared at it for a few seconds, then got up and put it at the bottom of the dresser drawer, among scarves and things she never used. She wouldn't give it to him. Not yet. That piece of paper was hers. It was what remained when nothing else could be said. The next day, she woke before the sun. The house was still asleep. The sky was tinged with gray, as if the day was born already tired. And so was she. She went down the stairs slowly, looked around that house that seemed so much hers, and at the same time never had been. She felt she was fading there, and feared that, if she stayed any longer, she would stop feeling altogether. She walked to the front door and turned the handle. The cold morning air touched her face like a warning. The world outside felt more real than everything she had lived inside that house, and for the first time, she seriously thought about leaving. On Monday, Ethan's phone rang before the sun had even risen. "We need to talk, now." The voice of the company's chief lawyer was urgent. 2 hours later, Ethan stood in front of a screen filled with plummeting charts, red numbers, and documents bearing signatures he hadn't made. One of the partners had been embezzling funds for over 8 months. The bomb had only now gone off. The media would soon get wind of it. The board wanted answers, and the empire he had spent years building was crumbling before his eyes. "Did you know?" he asked, staring at Adrian, who was closely following everything. "No, but I warned you that you needed to trust someone other than yourself." Ethan ran a hand over his face, exhausted. He'd slept poorly in recent days. Elena had occupied his thoughts more than he cared to admit. Her presence had begun to take up space in places he thought were locked away. And now, With the company falling apart, he didn't know what was harder, handling the crisis or dealing with what he felt. When he got home that night, Elena was waiting. She had heard parts of the news on the radio while driving. She was in the kitchen, stirring a pot absent-mindedly, when he walked in. "I heard, double quotes," she said, without turning her face. He didn't respond right away. He set his briefcase on the counter. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled up to the elbows, his eyes red with fatigue. "Everything is under control," he lied. Elena turned. Her eyes searched his, not with accusation, but with something he still didn't know how to receive. "Care, Ethan, You don't have to carry it all alone." He almost laughed, as if that were possible. As if someone could carry along what he himself couldn't even describe. But she didn't expect him to speak. She simply walked up to him and gently took his hands. It was the first time she touched him by her own choice, and he didn't pull away. She ran her fingers slowly over the knuckles of his hands, as if trying to memorize someone through touch. And the silence between them was different that time. It was full of presence. "I'm not your enemy," she whispered. He closed his eyes. "I don't know how to trust. Then start small, one step at a time." The phone rang in the living room. He pulled away slowly, as if that moment had been too brief a dream to last. But something had changed. For the first time, he hadn't fled from her touch. In the days that followed, the crisis worsened. Headlines splashed scandals. Ethan was pressured by shareholders and investors. His composure began to waver. Elena saw him arriving later and later, his face tense, his eyes lost. One night, she woke to a noise from downstairs. She found Ethan sitting on the office floor, papers scattered around him. His tie hung loose around his neck, his gaze empty. "You're losing everything on the outside," she said, kneeling beside him. "But what about on the inside?" He didn't answer. He just ran his hand through his hair and stared into the void. She touched his face. "You still have a choice." "What choice?" he murmured. "The choice not to lose yourself along with everything else. The choice not to shut down again. The choice not to push me away." He took a deep breath. His tired eyes met hers. And, for the first time, there was a real crack in that wall. His pain was coming out. Elena hugged him, and he didn't just allow it. He hugged her back. It took a while. It wasn't an impulsive gesture. It was like someone allowing themselves to fall after resisting for far too long. His empire might be falling. But, for the first time, the man inside the empire, was being touched. The rain fell all day, fine and persistent, as if the sky had grown tired of holding back the weight. Elena spent hours sitting in the armchair on the porch, her eyes fixed on the gray horizon, the letters still hidden deep in the drawer, pulsing like an unspoken truth. Since the embrace in the office, Ethan had changed. Small gestures, longer looks, softer silences, but there were still no words, and she no longer knew if she could wait for them. That afternoon, she walked into the closet and calmly packed a small suitcase. It wasn't an escape, it was a call to action. If he wanted her, he would have to choose. He would have to say it. On the brown envelope, she wrote his name with trembling letters. She left the letter on the bedroom table, took a deep breath, and left without a sound. In the living room, the picture frames were still empty, but the house smelled of something she still loved, despite everything. She closed the door slowly, and was gone. Ethan arrived in the early evening, soaked from the rain, exhausted from the meeting that sealed his position as CEO, still under investigation, but backed by the board. As he climbed the stairs, he sensed the silence was different. The house was empty of Elena. He went to her room, found the bed made, the windows closed, and on the table, the envelope. When he opened it, the world stopped. The letter was raw, honest, devastating. "You were the choice I made, even when I wasn't chosen. You were the absence that hurt the most. And still, I stayed. But now, I need to know if there's something in you that also chooses to stay." Ethan's hands trembled. He read the letter more than once. Each sentence was a mirror. Each word, a scream he had silenced for years. And then, he understood everything. He understood that love wasn't control. That being with someone required courage. That Elena was stronger than he had ever been. He threw his jacket on the couch, grabbed the car keys, ran down the stairs with his heart racing like never before. Drove through the city in the rain, the headlights reflecting in his wet eyes. On his phone, he tracked the last route of the private driver. She had requested a ride to the central station, probably a train to her mother's house. It was far, but there was still time. When he reached the station, he ran. He was soaked, but didn't care. He saw her from behind, near the platform. Loose hair, a coat too thin for the cold. The small suitcase beside her. The train approaching. "Elena," he shouted. She turned, and for a second she looked like she didn't believe it. "Ethan." He walked toward her, slowly, like someone who knows that any word might be too small. He stopped in front of her, looked into her eyes, and cried, "I read the letter." She said nothing. "I'm a coward. But if you still want me, ... He stepped closer. ... I don't want to run anymore." And for the first time, after 3 years, ... he touched her. He held her face in both hands, caressed it like someone asking for permission. And then, he kissed her, without hurry, without masks. It was a kiss that didn't ask for forgiveness. It was a kiss that finally said everything. The station disappeared around them. The rain fell as if washing away the past. Elena, at last, was chosen, and Ethan, for the first time, chose to love, without fear. The kiss at the station wasn't just a gesture. It was the breaking of a wall, the beginning of a new story within the same story. When Ethan's lips touched Elena's, it was as if the 3 years of silence had evaporated in seconds. There were no more contracts, no more fear, just the two of them, just truth. They said nothing afterward. They didn't need to. He picked up her suitcase. She walked beside him. The world could go on around them, the sound of the departing train, the announcements over the loudspeakers, the hurried footsteps of strangers, but there, in the center of the moment, only they existed. In the car, the silence was peaceful. She looked at the wet road, the raindrops streaming down the window. He, from time to time, glanced away from the road to look at her, as if still trying to believe she was there, that she was staying. They arrived home late. Ethan opened the door and let her go in first. For the first time, their steps were not distant. He followed her into the living room, but she stopped halfway, turned to him, her eyes wet and calm. "What happens now?" she whispered. He took a deep breath, moved closer, gently, as if not to scare her. "Now, I know you." His voice was thick with emotion. "Not just the woman who married me, but the woman who stayed even when she shouldn't have. The woman who waited for me, even without promises." She smiled with sadness in her eyes. "I didn't want to wait, but my heart never really knew how to leave." He touched her face again, this time, more firmly. His large, warm hand slid slowly to the back of her neck. Elena closed her eyes, felt the warmth, felt it was real. "I never knew how to do this," he confessed. "I was taught to dominate, not to feel, to conquer, not to surrender, but with you, I want to learn." She interlaced her fingers with his, and for the first time, their bodies met without resistance. They climbed the stairs together, their steps in sync. His bedroom felt different. There was no more coldness on the walls, no more distance in the neatly made bed. He turned off the lights, leaving only the bedside lamp on. The room was bathed in golden light and silence. Ethan approached her slowly, stopped, very close, eyes to eyes. Elena could feel his breath, his warmth, his racing heart. "Are you still afraid?" she asked. He nodded, but smiled with his eyes. "Yes, but for the first time. The fear doesn't paralyze me." She placed her hand over his chest, feeling the beat beneath his skin. And then, without words, they let their bodies say what their voices didn't know how to. It was delicate, unhurried, like someone tracing a map with their fingers for the first time. Ethan touched her as if afraid to break her. Elena gave herself as someone returning home after a long time. Every gesture was reverence. Every sigh, healing. There, in that once empty room, love stopped being absence and became a living presence. Hours later, lying side by side, the silence was no longer discomfort, it was comfort. He held her hand as if holding his own soul. She, with her head on his chest, listened to his heart beating for the first time, whole. "Do you still have that letter?" he asked, voice low, almost sleepy. "I do. Can I read it again? Tomorrow?" She smiled. "You can, but I think now, I'd rather tell you each word." Slowly, out loud, he kissed her forehead. "Thank you, for not leaving." "I did leave," she replied, "but you came." He laughed, and then fell asleep with her in his arms. It was early morning when the rain finally stopped. The sky began to lighten, shyly, behind the windows. And for the first time, since that house had been built, there was warmth inside it. Not the kind that comes from luxury, but the kind that comes from love. The days that followed had a different color. It wasn't a loud change, nor an immediate one, but it was visible. The house, once full of tense silences, now had new sounds. Quiet laughter, short but sincere conversations, the clinking of cups being washed together, the footsteps of two bodies sharing the same space without fear. Elena would wake up before him. She'd go down to make coffee, and slowly, she would listen to the news on the radio, with the sun streaming in through the window. Ethan would show up soon after, in socks, his hair still tousled, and sit beside her. He would eat in silence, but now it was a comfortable silence, as if time had learned how not to hurt anymore. He began leaving his phone aside during meals. He read real newspapers, asked how she was doing. He listened. One afternoon, she found him in the garden, replanting the hydrangeas she loved so much, the ones that had been torn out during a renovation. He wore an old t-shirt, his hands dirty with soil, his face younger without the usual CEO mask. When he saw her, he smiled in a new way. "Light. I never thought I'd see you doing that," she said, surprised. "I think I needed something real between my fingers," he replied, simply. They began sleeping together. Not just in the same room, but truly together. Sharing blankets, dreams, and once unimaginable secrets. Elena now knew his fears, the traumas locked away behind iron doors, and he, finally, knew hers. One night, during a blackout caused by a storm, they sat on the living room floor, surrounded by candles. They listened to music from an old portable radio. She lay her head in his lap. He stroked her hair for long minutes. "If I had touched you earlier," he murmured, "maybe everything would have been different." "Maybe it wasn't the right time," she answered. "Some things only bloom after the rain." He looked at her like someone who had found shelter, like someone who, after running for so long, finally chose to stay. And he did. Elena no longer needed hidden letters. Ethan no longer needed contracts. They read each other through their eyes, in the pauses, in the daily rhythm, in the way he waited for her in the garage at the end of the day, in the way she rested her head on his shoulder during a movie, and he didn't want the film to ever end. The house, once full of rules and rigidity, now had trails of crumbs, pillows out of place, books stacked in every corner, and, most importantly, photos. On the living room shelf, a new frame with a picture of the two of them. It was a simple portrait, taken in the garden, with the evening light in their eyes and genuine smiles on their faces. It was as if, finally, that house had become a home. After the storm, the sun returned, not in a hurry, but in truth. Some loves are born from encounters, others, from choices. Elena was never sure Ethan would love her, but she stayed anyway. Not because she was weak, but because she had faith. Faith that there was something behind the rigidity, the absence, the fear. And there was. Ethan was not an easy man to love. But her love didn't ask for ease. It asked for surrender, hope, time. That autumn afternoon, sitting on the porch, her resting against his chest, his hand firmly holding hers, they watched the garden that now truly bloomed, not because of the plants, but because of the memories that had started growing there. "I thought I would lose everything," he said quietly. "And you did," she replied with a calm smile. "But only what wasn't real." He nodded. The wind rustled the leaves. The sun filtered through the clouds like a blessing. "Do you still think loving is a risk?" she asked playfully. "I still do." He laughed softly. "But now I know that not loving is an even greater risk." She looked at him, and for a moment, no sound in the world was louder than that shared silence. Their story wasn't perfect. It had long pauses, cold distances, entire days without color, but it also had courage. Her courage to wait, his courage to finally open his heart. Because true love isn't made of easy promises. It's made of hard choices. It's what stays when everything else fades. And in that house, once filled only with contracts and control, now lived a love born from the improbable. A love that didn't give up. Sometimes, the silence between two people is louder than any argument, and other times, it's in that silence that love decides to be born. Today, you followed a story about waiting, courage, and transformation. About a love that didn't shout, but endured, even when everything seemed to say there was no more time. If you've made it this far, thank you for feeling this story with us. Every second watched, every shared emotion strengthens the purpose of Lasting Tales, to tell stories that reach the places we don't always have words for. If this video moved you, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next stories we're already preparing with all our heart. And tell me in the comments, have you ever lived or waited for a love like this? If you want to be moved even more, click here and watch one of the most unforgettable stories on our channel. I promise it will touch you deeply too. After all, here at Lasting Tales, every story leaves a mark that time can't erase. We'll see you in the next one.